Welcome back to Beautiful Work, Beautiful Life with Laurel and Laurel, the two Laurels. Hey, Laurel, how are you today?
I'm well. How are you today?
I'm doing really well. We have a great topic, and we probably need every minute to talk about it. And the topic is I feel like I need a drum roll for this one, Laurel. It's so big. Compassion versus judgment for other people's choices. Whew.
We need every minute and then
I
some for this
know.
one.
I know. I have to say that I personally, I'll call myself out. I really had such a big judge in me. And when other people were exhibiting what I consider to be bad behavior, I was the biggest critic and internal judge of all of that, of anybody's business. And it was hard work to change that, I have to tell you. I'm just gonna put it right out there, right at the beginning, everybody who's listening, especially for the people that are listening to me and they know me as being a really compassionate, non-judgmental, understanding person. It's probably because I had to look at like my own judge, right? Who, of course, is first and foremost a self critic and a self judge, and get to work on how was I going to not uphold that because I did not value judgment. I valued compassion and understanding and kindness and respect. And I felt like every time I was judging internally, I was not any of those things that I valued. For me, it was a lot of work, and I'm so glad that I did it because it's so freeing to be free of the judge, not free of the internal judge, but to be aware of it when it comes up. Like, oh, there's my judge. Yeah,
There's Judge Laurel again. Here she
here's Judge
comes.
Laurel. Oh, she thinks she's so big and smart. Oh, look at her.
So I have so many questions.
Mm.
Now, our listeners may not know this, but we don't know each other. We know each other well now, but it hasn't been a lifetime of knowing each other. We
Yeah,
met
yeah,
maybe 14, 15 months ago.
yeah,
So two questions.
yeah.
What do you see as the root of your judgment?
Mm. Yeah,
It's one of my questions.
yeah.
And then how did you overcome that?
Mm. So the first one is, I think ultimately, as I peeled away layers and did a lot of my work, I think my judge was really a form of maintaining a sense of inner control. Like if I judged it and I put it in a category, I had control over it in my inner world. And even though I might not be able to control it out there, I did a lot of inner judging because I was also a conflict avoider. So if you're going to be a judge, a person that just has a lot of opinions and judges everything, you got to be ready for some conflict if you're just going to spit it out there, right? So mine was all internalized because I didn't want to have conflict with people. So I might have been thinking, wow, that's not very good. But on the outside, I was going, oh, okay, going along with things, right? So, yeah. So I feel like for me, it was just a sense of control, like, you know, and it was also probably a self validation of my own value system, oh, I don't think that's very nice, right? Or I don't think that's a kind way to be in the world. And so I would judge it rather than call somebody out on it. And it was because really it was just validating. I think kindness is a good thing. And so I think the world should everybody should be kind in the world, right? Yeah. So that's the answer to your first question. And the answer to your second question is probably first becoming aware of it, always awareness first, right? Second, this actually came from one of my first teachers, awareness, tolerance, choice. He used to always say ATC, 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 awareness, tolerance, and choice. So being aware that my judge and my critic had the upper hand internally, and then tolerating it. So rather than judging the judge, just going, oh, there's my judge, and then seeing what it was saying, tolerating the experience. Also, where we were in our last podcast was like doing the intern. How is that making me feel? Like, what does embodied judgment actually feel like? Which for
Ooh,
me feels really lousy. It does not feel good in my body. Like, I don't like the way it feels. And then choosing to say, oh, I don't want to be judging here. What is it? How is it that I want to show up? And what am I going to do differently? Right. Which for me comes back to something I know you've talked about a lot in our podcast, which is replacing the judge with curiosity. Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I love that you brought up, the embodied judgment. If any of our listeners have ever experienced judgment feeling good in their bodies, I want to know, because I do think judgment is a feeling that doesn't feel good.
No, not for me.
And the curiosity is hard. We're raised in a world where things are right or wrong, right? We're taught this from our earliest experience, right? This is right and this is wrong. And what is right or wrong for you, for me, for any person, is really the system that we grew up in, right?
Yeah.
And so it's hard not to judge. Oftentimes judgment, I think, comes from fear. And our fear comes from the uncomfortableness of, oh, they're not like me, right? I'm not like them. So let me judge them so I don't have to continue to feel that this longing for belongingness, right? Like, oh, they're different than me. Let me judge them. And that makes it safe for me to be separate from them.
Right.
And so the curiosity, for me, it was not intentional, but I think from a very young age, I have been very open to accepting other people's differences. I don't really know where it came from. At a young age, I wouldn't have called it curiosity, but just acknowledging that, okay, that's not for me, but there must be a reason it's for them. Now, I can say that with, kind of still the rules of the game of, harming other people is never okay in my mind, right? But how can you accept someone's choices? They're different than yours, but that person is different than you.
Yeah, absolutely. So this transition, right, for having compassion for people's choices versus judging people's choices is really, that transition word is just the word you just said, which is accepting, right? Other people's choices, that they're their choices. There may not be our choices, but they are their choices. And then what do you do with that afterwards, right? You might not embrace it or applaud it or whatever, but there's always a reason that people choose what they choose. And I think, I mentioned this in another podcast, my compassion, my state of compassion grew the most from when I had a therapist who said, see everybody as the walking wounded. Imagine everybody with a big bandage around their head, right? And most people's poor behavior or hurtful behavior, usually if you can travel back internally in their story, it comes from them being hurt. Wounded people wound other people generally. Yes. And so to have compassion that they have a story that brought them to this place where they're behaving less than maybe exemplary or kind or whatever it is. It's not that we are going to embrace it or want more of it, but there can be some compassion there. And not just quick judgment, right? To start to recognize, to be curious about what is their story? How did they get from here to here? And honestly, I'm going to just put this out there as my big opinion of the day, but, I think we need that in the world more than anything else today, is because we're so divided in our culture in so many different ways. And we don't have tolerance for the other people's story. And we don't know how to have curiosity about how do they come to believe that or want that?
This might be a rabbit hole. Just a warning. Here we go. But
warning.
It comes. I can't help but think of harm. Like, so in the world we live in, where we are so protective of what is, our right or what is ours. We really do interpret harm. What's harmful to me? But if we could take a step back and really, is it harmful to me that this person, believes this or values this or thinks this is important, right? I mean, again, and there are places that, wounded people wound people, or hurt people hurt people. And so there is a time when, yes, it is directly harmful, but so much of what we get all worked up over and judge other people for really has nothing to do with us individually.
Yeah.
Right. And so that would be, even more than curiosity, it would be, is it harmful to me? Right.
Yeah.
Most often it's not.
Right. And I think, I want to go back to, now that I've called myself out and sound like a really judgy person, I want to go back to like who I am in my heart of hearts, which is I'm not really a judgy person. It might be too late to sound that way, but I really am not. And I feel like what I am is I'm really sensitive and I'm really empathic and I really care about other people deeply. And if I'm around people that don't exhibit those qualities as well, I can get very hurt and I need to self-protect. And so there's that component, right? That we talked about, where does my judge come from? That's that need for control, right? And not always in a bad way. Like it can sound like, oh, I have a high level of need for control. That's a bad thing. But it's also a good thing, because I'm an empathic person. And if I don't control my environment to a certain extent, right, I'm not going to be a help to anybody, because I'm going to just feel so worn out and so tired and so exhausted by everybody else's energy, or be giving or trying to take care of people. And so in the wrong and maybe not a helpful way. So like these things are all related. And that's why we're having this conversation today, because it can be a complex equation to look at for yourself.
It is. And when I mentioned the rabbit hole before, one of the thoughts I had that I didn't get to, because you know how my thoughts happen, they come and go so quickly, but was about boundaries, right? And so compassion and judgment, you can't have compassion and you can't have judgment without having boundaries. And let's face it, boundaries are important and good for you, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And so, when you think, we are people who are capable of judging at times. That's different than we're judgmental people, right? We have the capability to be compassionate, and we have the capability to be judgmental.
Right.
But we also have the authority and capability to have boundaries. And so it is true, if someone harms you, violates your boundaries, that might result in a judgment first and compassion second, right?
Right. Absolutely.
So, it is a messy mix of things we're talking about here.
It is. And I want to say for our listeners, this is a really important point that you're bringing up, because we can get confused or misunderstand like the pathway out that we're talking about. And you can have a lot of compassion and still set really strong boundaries with somebody else. Those things can go hand in hand, because you're compassionate for somebody's wounding or bad story or whatever doesn't mean you're going to excuse their bad behavior or let them get away with it, quote unquote, or make it okay that they did it. That's not compassion. Compassion is simply, being with somebody else in feeling and understanding there's something there, right, to be understood. And it isn't that we're saying it's okay because you're compassionate. What you did was okay. Those are, and even acceptance isn't that. It's just knowing this thing happened and now what, right? Well, now what are we going to do with it? So I feel like it's so important for us to understand that, because I do think that, especially for people that are really sensitive or people that have been manipulated by other people that are less understanding or less kind or less respectful of their time, they've come to believe that they're supposed to be compassionate. Or compassion is about overlooking other people's bad behavior or whatever. So we need to really look at that. That's a big one for yourself to tease out. Where are you with that? What does that mean to you? And how can you be compassionate and set boundaries that are healthy for you? and other people.
I'm so glad you went there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it has me thinking about if we are using our compassion or our acceptance as mechanisms or means to avoid conflict, that might be the red flag, right? For
That's good.
How, when you are compassionate, when you are accepting, what's the reason behind that? Is it really because you're practicing, more objective, observer, non-judgmental behavior, or is it because you are avoiding conflict?
Right. And not wanting or not being willing to stand up for what you really believe in.
That's right.
To address like the bigger, to kind of, I think there's a certain level as we're speaking about all of this, right? The word self-leadership keeps coming up, this idea of like being the leader first of yourself, right? How you want to show up in the world, understanding your value system, adhering to that, leading yourself in that way, and then leading others to be able to communicate in those ways where you've already done your work, right? And you can speak about compassion, you can speak about kindness, you can ask them what their value is around that, have a conversation about the beautiful work, really is what we're talking about. Like, how do we start to lead other people in having conversations about this work that we're doing? If it's not on their top of their priority list, but they still want to have relationships with us, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that ties back into boundaries, right?
Yeah. And communication. So important.
So much to talk about, Laurel.
I know. So, Laurel, when you think about compassion, versus judgment of other people's choices, do you feel like there's something else today we really need to kind of get into, or somewhere else that we need to go with our topic that we haven't yet? Anything else kind of percolating in there?
I had one more thought, and it's about judgment. When judgment shows up, often we judge other people for exactly what we judge ourselves for, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And so when judgment shows up and perhaps you're judging someone else, maybe just pause long enough to ask, why do I judge myself for that?
Yeah. And how do I?
Yeah. How do I judge myself for that? Yeah. Is your judgment of others misplaced? And can you soften? Can you be more self-compassionate?
Yeah.
So as a way of learning to judge other people less.
Yeah. I want to use an example here because I feel like what you're talking about has that piece to it. And then I think another kind of a counterpiece to that is judging ourselves so deeply or avoiding judgment that it's a shadow thing in ourselves, and it's something that we're not even acknowledging that we have. And I'm going to use myself as an example, and an example in my life, because this was big work for me at some point, right? I was really bothered by people that would come into conversation and they would only talk about themselves and they wouldn't ask anything about anyone else. And I found it narcissistic, and selfish, and self-absorbed. And like I had all, judgments around it, how it was. And I had to come to terms with it because these people were in my life and they weren't going to go anywhere because they happened to be FAMILY. And so I had to, really come to terms with this, right? And so I would, knowing what I had known, I'd been doing my beautiful work for quite a while, and I would sit with myself in my meditation chair and I'd say, okay, how is this showing up in me? How is this showing up in me? And what is it that I must be judging myself? And I finally discovered that it was really a shadow aspect of myself, right? It was, I wouldn't talk about myself. Like I literally like shut myself down because I didn't want to be seen that way. And so I was probably too shut down around myself. And And I don't know how to walk. And I also don't know how to walk into the room and just start talking about myself and commanding attention. It's not my natural state, right? Neither one. And so what I had to do is like stay with that for a while, right? And say, who says that's a bad quality? Right? I want attention. I want people to listen to me. It's not that I don't want to be attended to or heard or understood or be witnessed. I want those things. Those things are really, really important to me. And so those people can just go get it, right? They have no problem with just going and getting it. Like, why is that a bad thing, Laurel?
And why can't I be just like that?
Why now I want that quality, right? So to like sit with the thing that we're judging, to look at where it is or isn't showing up in our lives, to be honest with ourselves about that, to come to terms with that. How does that show up in me or not show up in me, or why am I uncomfortable with that part of myself, or whatever it is such a beautiful journey. And I will tell you that it's helped me a lot, right? It's helped me a lot in those relationships to just accept this is how they show up in relationships. Am I ever going to have a really deep, intimate relationship with them? Seems unlikely, right? But it doesn't make it wrong or bad, right? I don't need to be judging that as wrong or bad or a wrong way to be in relationships. Like, hey, if it works for them in other relationships in their life, who am I to say it's wrong or bad? I don't. Why would I? Who am I to say that's you need to change? Like, yeah, no, I'm not.
It's such a good example. And oftentimes it is that which we judge are parts of ourselves that we have neglected, abandoned, ignored, that we just don't, for whatever reason, we don't let that come through us.
Yeah. And I think it's also being okay with, for me, it was also okay with, you can have a cordial and friendly or distant or just an okay relationship with people in your family. Doesn't have to always be great and intimate and deep and whatever. It can just be kind of like whatever it is. Why is that wrong? Again, why is that wrong or bad? All people aren't for all people.
Yes.
We that's why we live in communities and groups and get along, and all of that. And our job is, I think, as we said before, in this world today, is to be tolerant, that there are others out in the world that are not like us. And if we could just do no harm, we'd be probably okay with all of that.
Do no harm and don't imagine harm being done to you.
Yes.
How is,
right,
how is someone that might be a little more self-focused? How are they harming you?
Right.
Are they?
Right. No, absolutely not. And now it was my choice. Once I could see it for what it was and I was okay with it and I came to terms, it was like, oh, hey, they're not my people. They're not my people. That's okay. Yeah.
It's so good.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah. So we invite everybody today to, as you're beginning to live more and more in the beautiful work, to look at this idea of judgment and how can you begin to develop, a sense of curiosity, compassion, bring compassion into it. We need so much more compassion than we need judgment in the world today. We are in a, if we saw like the scales, right? And compassion was on one side and judgment was on the other. Compassion would be lifting off the ground, judgment would be so heavy, right? We have so much of it. And I think, collectively, the more that we can grow some compassion and bring it to our relationships and ourselves, how much more beautiful the world will be. Yeah.
Oh, it just sounds so much more peaceful, even within ourselves, start there, right?
Yeah.
Start within.
So, any journaling question coming up for you, Laurel, for our listeners today?
I think the journaling question I would raise is, pay attention to judgment. Just notice when judgment shows up for you, and just, notice or kind of feel into, is that judgment an indicator of something that you are judging yourself for, or that a shadow side that you do not allow to exist. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's great. I'm going to go back to what you said before, encourage people to also, as you're journaling in that way, see if you can do the exercise of how, when you're in a state of judging, right? Forget the story, because judging tends to be a thought thing that we have. It's a very much a head game. So forget that for a little bit, and then come down and start to notice how you feel in your body. Like, let's start to connect. You know, you and I were talking about how uncomfortable it is really to feel judgment. Where do you feel the judgment in your body? How does it feel? What's happening in your body as you're judging and your mind is doing all that? What's actually happening in your physical body, and beginning to pay attention to that. And then I would encourage everybody to do that same exercise, and just replace the word compassion for judgment, right? What you suggested around judgment, just notice your compassion, notice when it's coming up. And the same thing with your body, how you feel in your body when you're experiencing compassion, right? Yeah.
Oh, those are great. We're going to have fun with those journal prompts this week.
We are going to go deep in my relationship with my compassion this week, and my judgment, and really bring it back to the forefront. Notice where I am with all of that.
Good. So, well, thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you for the rich conversation today. And we invite our listeners to feel free to send us questions. I know we say that oftentimes in our exit and our intro, but we really mean it. You know, if you have questions, or you have topics that, you want us to speak into, or questions, feel free to send them along. We're here for you, and we will see everybody next week. Right, Laurel?
Yes, I can't wait.
Me too.
Have a great week. Bye.
You too. Bye. Bye for now.